You're live.
All right, good afternoon, everybody. Let me go ahead and call this special town council meeting to order. I do want to make a couple comments. First, I want to thank everybody for including. Let me go ahead and call this special town council meeting to order. Stephanie, I'm getting feedback for some reason. Do you know why?
You should be.
We heard it too.
Yes, we
Someone
did.
had it playing on the YouTube, so
Okay.
you're good. You should be good now.
All right, I'm going to hold for just a second till that stops, and then are we good?
Yes, sir.
All right. Just a couple comments I wanted to make. First of all, I just wanted to explain the reasons for our move of this meeting from Monday to Wednesday. I suspect that most people are aware, but we did have a delay on Monday. There was a regional and national outage of Zoom that started just prior to our Monday meeting. And for anybody else that was on a Zoom call somewhere and it was able to work, apparently the problem they had didn't impact all of their operations, but what it did impact is our ability to feed our meetings to YouTube so the public could hear them. So we could have held our meeting, but we could not have done it in a way where the public could have heard us. We've never experienced that before, but that is why we had to reschedule for today, and for however many of you are in the public listening, we thank you for coming back and tuning back in today. I also just want to quickly explain why we are having this special meeting today. Considering that we have a regular town council meeting scheduled for next Tuesday. Two reasons. One, we have one item on the agenda, which we're going to get to in a second, which has a time impact. We could not wait till Tuesday. We have to deal with it this week. And it will be evident why in a minute. And then second, and most importantly, the presentation and discussion that we're going to be having on the HRNA Kiawah Island housing market study is a significant presentation. It is one that we want to make sure that we're taking a good full period of time to listen to and to think about, and trying to insert that sort of presentation in the midst of a regular town council meeting with 5, 6, 7 other agenda items. Does not lend itself to the best discussion. So we are separating that out for this discussion today. So that's the reason why we're doing this a week early. So with that as background, I want to go ahead and get into our actual business. We have one item of new business, and this is to consider the approval of emergency ordinance 2020-09. It's an amended emergency ordinance of the town council of the town of Kiawah Island regarding face coverings, restrictions on restaurants, establishments that possess a state permit to sell alcohol, other businesses and facilities, and essential businesses. Let me summarize real quickly, because anybody who's opened up the ordinance, you'll see it's very, very lengthy. And importantly, it only does a couple things. First of all, I want to stress that this is simply an extension of existing ordinances. We are not in this imposing any new requirements related to the coronavirus. It's extending those that are currently in place. It is extending those existing requiremements until October 25th. And that's where I get to the time reason we had to do this. Under the emergency order we have in place, we can only pass an emergency ordinance for, I think, Joe, 60 days. Is that correct? And at the end of 60 days, we then have to either reconsider it or it expires. So the existing ordinance would have expired at the end of this week. And what we are doing here is extending these requirements another 60 days to October 25th. And among the many items, essentially what this is doing is it is extending the face covering ordinance that is currently in place, which relates to the requirement for wearing a face covering when you are in a business or when you are waiting to enter waiting to enter a business or waiting for takeout food at a dining establishment. It is also adopting all of the recent state orders that related to the sale of alcohol after 11 p.m. The requirements for inside dining that relate to both hygiene, distancing of tables, and other requirements. The occupancy limits that the governor established for mass gatherings. It also extends our occupancy limits for essential businesses, which in shorthand is the occupancy limit on Harris Teeter. And it also establishes the fine at up to $100. So that is the crux of the ordinance. And what I would ask is for a motion to approve the adoption of ordinance 2020-09.
So moved.
Do I have a second?
Second.
Do I have any comments or questions?
None from me.
None. Joe, our town attorney, anything to add or anything I missed?
Nope, I did adjust our definition of mask and the list of exceptions to mirror what the governor's new order did. But they weren't significant changes.
All right. All right, so we've got a motion and a second. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. All right, so the motion passes. All right, so that gets us to the most important and the significant item on the agenda. And I don't, again, this is going to be, I think, a fairly long presentation. Stephen, have we got you now on the call? Great, okay.
Yes, sir.
I don't want to take, this is going to be an extensive presentation, so I don't want to take a lot of time away from it for comments. What I would ask for anybody, obviously the town council is fully up to speed and has been a part of both establishing this study. But for anybody in the public who's listening in, probably I would refer you back to the town's communication last Friday that described this meeting. And in there is a summary, I think a really good description of how this study was generated, what some of the key objectives of this study were. And if you have a chance, rather than my taking up a lot of time to go through that, I would reference you back to that. But in summary, to way over summarize, there are really two major things we were trying to accomplish here. What we were asking was an outside independent expert firm to help us better understand, help the community, not just the town, but the community, better understand both how in the past and how currently Kiowa's property values have fared and are faring relative to other markets, and especially compared to other comparative communities like ourselves. And then second, what we were wanting to understand is to try to begin to identify what some of the key issues are that the community might need to consider and address if our obvious goal in the future is to try to continue to retain strong property values on Kiowa Island. Now, there's more to it than that, but I think that sort of capsulizes the two major intentions of the study. I also just want to, before I turn it over to Steve with HR&A, highlight a couple points. One, I want to make sure everybody understands we're not taking any actions today. The town council will not be voting on anything, approving anything. I think the best way to think about this is like a town council workshop or a presentation. The town council has not had the opportunity yet to review or discuss, or prior to Friday, even see the draft report. So the town council members today are seeing this for the first time. So it very much is an opportunity for the council to hear from HR&A an overview of the study report, to be able to ask questions, make sure they understand it. It will be primarily tilted towards presentation, but we will not be debating items. We won't be getting into depth on issues. We won't be adopting or agreeing to things. It very much is a first shot at understanding the report. The town council will take this report up again next week at the regular meeting, where at that point I anticipate we'll have some more in different kind of discussion. The second thing I want to really emphasize is that necessarily to do a report like this, we have had to and wanted to engage a large part of the community. So this report has had participation from major entities such as the resort, Kiowa Partners, the Conservancy, the Community Association, area realtors. We've gotten input from residents, both full-time and part-time residents. So necessarily there has been a significant amount of input into the study. At the same time, I want to make clear that in no way does the fact that these entities that provided input mean that in any way they yet endorse the report. They're going to get a chance in the future to review it, to discuss it within their own organizations, to consider what it might mean for them and what they might want to do about any findings or any recommendations. But I want to make sure that what you are seeing today are the study recommendations and findings from the consultant. And in many cases, I suspect down the road, different entities will probably agree with much or most of what's in the report. But I'm sure there will be other areas where there is not an agreement or they see a different direction. So I don't want there to be any confusion that somehow because there's something put on the screen here that suggests that the resort might consider something or KICA might consider something that they, by their participation in this report, have any way at this point endorsed it. Finally, I do want to, though, be clear that we will be providing opportunities for a broad-based communication and involvement from all of these entities into the study. I anticipate that over the next weeks and months, we'll be reviewing the study with KICA and with the resort. We already have communicated to you an opportunity for property owners to provide questions to HRNA, and a session has been planned next week, Monday, where you can actually listen to HRNA address either the many or few questions that are presented to them. In a normal world, it would have been our desire, obviously, to put together a number of actual face-to-face community meetings. This is an awkward way to do it, but obviously with coronavirus, we don't have the opportunity that we might have had a year ago to call a town hall meeting and get 100 people in the room. So we obviously apologize for that, but we will find every way we can in the coming months to make sure that we're able to talk about this to different groups. Lastly, I think for those of you who are familiar with the sea level rise study, I think what we're doing here is very analogous to that. 2 years ago, we had an independent group who created and did a study, created an outstanding set of both findings and recommendations. And even to this day, all of the different entities on the island are still working their way through those recommendations. And in some cases, we've adopted some, and some we haven't. And it's taken several years to think our way through those. And I think I see this study probably evolving in the same way. So with that, what I'm going to ask is Stephen, who is our head consultant with HRNA, to introduce himself quickly and his people. Say just a couple comments about who HRNA is, and then I'm going to turn it over to him. Steve, cheers.
Thank you, Craig, and thank you everyone for having us today. Yeah, I'll start. I see many familiar faces, a couple new ones, and I know there's many other people listening and watching in. So just to introduce myself, I'm Stephen Riley. I'm a principal with HRNA Advisors, and I'm joined by my colleague Keely Gaston, who's also here today. HRNA is a real estate and economic development advisory firm, and so what that means is we operate across a range of areas that relate to the built environment and enhancing and improving the built environment. And that includes projects such as disaster response in Puerto Rico for Hurricane Maria, but also supporting development of Amazon's HQ2 in Northern Virginia. It's a pretty wide range of areas, but all focused within the core area of real estate and economic development. So within that, market studies, and in particular, housing market studies are a core part of what we do. So we're really excited to undertake and work on this study, and are looking forward to talking through it with you all today. We started this study back in February, so about 6 months ago at this point. Sort of pre-COVID, or the world as we know it today, feels very different at this point. But during that time, we've been working on analyzing Kiawah's housing market, understanding drivers, and developing a set of recommendations in the form of action items. And as the mayor mentioned, those recommendations and action items are in response to what we see as the identified strengths, challenges, opportunities, weaknesses of Kiawah, but are not necessarily anything that are endorsed by the town or other stakeholders at this point in time. Really just what we view as strategies to respond to what we see happening within the housing market in Kiawah. Keela, do you want to go ahead and share our screen? Let me know if you all are able to see this.
Yes, we are.
We're good.
Great. So there's a lot of material that we covered over the course of our analysis. As you can imagine, thinking about housing markets, there are many, many, many variables that impact values, overall market conditions. And so all that is to say, there's a lot of information, and we're focusing today on really covering the key findings and takeaways, but recognizing that there is a lot of additional detail on the back end that really feeds into those key findings and takeaways. So our plan is to go through that really in a sort of summary fashion, but to the extent that there are specific points that you all are interested in or want to talk through in more detail, we are happy to do that, and can also refer to the full set of the full draft report that we've produced, to talk through any specific questions you may have. So,
Stephen, let me ask you, how would it work best for you if, as the council members have questions or clarification, do you want them to interject when you're at that point, or hold them? What helps your flow the best?
Yeah, so I'm happy, as you all have questions, do feel free to ask them in real time. I'm happy to have this, be more discussion based versus having me, drone on and then jump back to things. So please do feel free to make this very discussion based and ask questions as you have any, and we can talk through them in real time. But I'll start just with a quick introduction, executive summary, and then, as I mentioned, go through the key themes, our SWOT analysis that we conducted, and then how that really translated into our strategy toolkit. So I guess, for starters, in thinking about why undertake a study like this, the town engaged HRNA to work on this, but in thinking about what is really driving this, the mayor talked about this a little bit, and really, the way it was framed to us and the way we've thought about it and working on this is really establishing a baseline for market conditions on Kiawah Island, and recognizing that there hasn't been a real clear sense of data that is grounded in analysis by a third party and conducted independently to understand where market conditions are. So that really was our first key guiding question: is what are the housing market conditions on Kiawah? And then building on that, we then thought about how do those conditions compare to what's happening in communities elsewhere? How does Kiawah compare to peers, and what is its relative positioning? From there, thinking about what's influencing housing values on Kiawah. So once you understand the metrics and the performance, what's actually driving those metrics and that performance? And so we conducted a deep dive analysis in a number of different areas, as we'll get into, to really understand the components that we see as influencing the performance of the market. And then lastly, wanted to then think about, okay, with that base understanding and awareness of factors that are influencing value, how do we make sure that Kiowa can be proactive in responding to current or future challenges that may face the housing market, and that's really where a lot of our recommendations and action items come into play. So since February, our scope of work has really entailed a data-driven approach to understand and evaluate the key framing questions that I just walked through. There are really 4 key components of our scope of work. We started first and foremost with interviews and engagement. So as the mayor mentioned, meeting with a really broad swath of stakeholders on Kiowa, including entities such as the town, Kika, the resort, Kiowa partners, others, but also a number of residents, both part-time, full-time, really making sure that we're getting a full picture and grounding of the current context within Kiowa, and input for a lot of the analysis and work that we did. From there, we undertook a market assessment that relied heavily on market data that we both collected locally from Kiowa stakeholders, but also through national third-party sources that we use as a standard practice for housing market studies that we do. We also conducted a stakeholder assessment, and that was really focused on understanding the basic governance structure of Kiowa and how different stakeholders have responsibilities and oversight over different components, and thinking primarily about the town, Kika, Kiowa partners, and others, what their responsibilities are, and particularly how that's going to change over time. One of the key things guiding this study, I think, is recognizing the sort of the critical moment that exists for Kiowa at this point in time, as the island matures and gets to a point where in coming years we'll reach sellout of existing properties, and so that that transition from a community that is under development to a community that has been developed, and recognizing how that impacts housing market dynamics, and ultimately some of the recommendations that we make, and that really feeds into this last piece, which is the findings and recommendations, and what we see as the strategies that various stakeholders on the island can pursue and explore further as they think about ensuring long-term health of the housing market. So starting fairly broadly in terms of how we approach this type of analysis, and particularly in the context of Kiowa, housing values and housing market conditions within a high-end residential resort community like Kiowa are influenced and driven by 4 fundamental drivers, and we've laid those out here. And these drivers, they're interrelated. They really build on one another, but together form the basis for how you can think about what is driving housing market health. And so first, you start with physical assets, and that is the housing, buildings, and other infrastructure that exist on the island, and sort of a baseline for how you would think about the housing market. Then beyond that, it's also equally important to think about the experience. So in addition to the physical assets, what is it about the amenities, services, environment that make Kiowa a place where people want to live or visit? Really providing the sort of all-encompassing experience in addition to those physical assets. With those 2 items together, you can then think about the brand and appeal. So based on that sort of that package of physical assets and experience, how are you marketing that? How is that conveyed externally? Are current and prospective owners aware and interested in what Kiowa has to offer? So how do you make sure that you're driving that awareness and creating a brand that people are interested in? And then lastly, you can think about investment value. So once you've sort of considered and evaluated the first 3 items, wrapping that all together and thinking about how properties on Kiowa perform as real estate investments. of course, within those 4 drivers, there are, more specific components that feed into each of them, and each of which are included as important parts of our study. And so when I referenced the deep dive analysis that we did, it really was in getting into a lot of these really specific components that feed into those 4 main drivers. So for example, in thinking about physical assets, really looking at the housing stock on the island and analysis of that, analyzing the public and private facilities, and then evaluating also separately the infrastructure and components related to that. And similar approach for these other components as well. And that leads us to some of our really key takeaways, that we found within our study. I think first and for starters is just recognizing, Kiwa's position as a top-tier residential resort community, and has maintained and established a premium relative to peers, consistently over time. And that leadership position is really one that Kiwa has been in essentially since its founding 40 years ago, and maintained over time. That is largely driven by the really comprehensive package of experience that Kiwa offers, relative to peers and other potential locations that someone may look to buy a home. And that's driven by things like the really incomparable location and environment that exists, the variety of flagship amenity options, both in terms of natural amenities that you can think of like the beach or natural landscapes, but also in man-made amenities, so golf, recreational facilities, etc. Kiwa has, obviously a very unique luxury lifestyle, and that's an experience that's branded and gives it a reputation as a premier regional and national destination. So we see that all as, very positive, and really, that Kiwa is generally positioned well right now. And Keely, if you flip to the next page, that really translates into a strong housing market performance. We did in-depth analysis of housing market metrics, and we see, generally speaking, that Kiwa's market has been performing very well since the recession. Obviously, during the recession, there were impacts, and that was seen nationally. But based on the analysis and data we reviewed, we saw Kiwa's response to the recession was generally better than peers, and since the recession has generally outperformed peers in the regional housing market. You can look at a couple example data points that we've noted here, but we'll also get into it a bit further within our study, of pretty strong housing market values of median single family homes of 1.2 million that have grown just under 2% per year since 2010. So generally keeping pace with inflation. A healthy number of home sales occurring over time, and continued growth in the number of new construction permits. And that's not to say that there aren't challenges that exist, but I think it is to really emphasize the point that we view the housing market as very healthy based on the data that we've reviewed. There are a number of communities that we work in where that is not the case, and there are sort of clear red flags that emerge in terms of challenging market conditions when you look at the data, and that's generally not what we see here. Still, though, it is really important that in recognizing that there are challenges that loom or that exist, and it's going to be really critical for Kiwa and its stakeholders to be proactive in addressing those challenges. Again, getting back to this idea that Kiwa is maturing, and there's a need to sort of recognize that, and again, be very proactive about that. And that proactive nature is more important as time goes on, in ensuring the long-term health of the market. And specifically, we've identified 5 key areas where we see this as really critical. The first is in driving reinvestment. So when communities are initially being built out, the focus is on just that initial investment, new development, new construction. But as the island matures, this really shifts more toward reinvestment. So maintaining the assets that you have, and that includes homes that people live in, and residents, owners, visitors are occupying, but also the facilities that are run by different entities, and the general infrastructure that exists on the island. A key thing that I would point out here that we found in our analysis, and we'll talk through a bit later, is particularly the need to drive reinvestment within villa units, where in situations where you have shared ownership structures and a board that's controlling buildings, exterior and facade reinvestments, or any sort of reinvestments that require sort of broad approval can pose challenges. And that's something that's not specific to Kiawah. It's really more specific to just condo structure as a whole, but will be really critical in helping drive that reinvestment activity and ensuring there is reinvestment in those properties, as well as all of the properties on Kiawah. Second is working to maintain competitive positioning. So as I mentioned, Kiawah has really been regarded as a leader, in the context of residential resort communities, but it requires being proactive about that going forward to really maintain that. And so ensuring that there's an awareness of what other communities are doing, and that there's a clear response to that to ensure that Kiawah remains a market leader. The third point is focused on sustaining lifestyle marketing. And this is sort of a more specific point related to marketing that exists on Kiawah today. Kiawah sort of benefits from natural exposure to the island through people that are visiting either at the resort or through short-term rentals. But those visitors then become aware of Kiawah, understand it, and based on their experience, often will then eventually become prospective home buyers. Separate from that, there's also formal marketing that's done both by by brokerage firms, by the resort, by Kiawah partners, and some of that is what we refer to as lifestyle marketing, which is really general awareness of the island to really introduce it to people, make them aware, and perhaps then attract them to either come visit or be interested in prospective home purchasing. Right now, that's really led by Kiawah partners with some input as well from the resort. But over time, as the island approaches sellout, there's going to be less of a role that Kiawah partners plays in that lifestyle marketing, and it'll be important to think about how you encourage that marketing going forward, and maintain those formal marketing channels. The fourth point is a focus on attracting future generations of buyers, and this is primarily born out of the fact that Kiawah Island's median age of both owners and residents has been skewing older over time. And so as you think about the types of housing that you're offering, the marketing that you're doing, and just the general environment that you're creating, making sure that you're attracting future generations of buyers to ensure that long-term cycle of market health. And then lastly, a real focus on balancing STRs. So really recognizing the revenue that STRs can generate for property owners, but at the same time, the quality of life factors that are at play for residents on the island that could be potentially negatively impacted by short-term rentals. And so this, Kaylee, if you go to the next page, this focus on balance is really born out of this recognition of the diverse groups of property owners and visitors, and sort of the role that they each play in the long-term health of Kiawah's housing market. And so this is within the analysis that we've done, what we see is something that makes Kiawah really unique relative to other communities, is Kiawah's ability to be successful over time in balancing the sort of sometimes varied interests of these different stakeholders. or these different groups. But they each play a role in supporting long-term health and are each a component in driving housing market values where you see them today. And the reason we focus on sort of maintaining that balance is recognizing that, if any policies or changes are made to disrupt that or diminish the appeal to any of these groups, that will have broader impacts on the housing market. So if there was to be broad policy swings that restricted access to visitors, and the number of visitors were to decrease, that takes out a component of demand within the housing market. Similarly, or conversely, if you were to go the other way and say have broad policy swings that restricted or limited the appeal of Kiawah to full-time residents, and that group started decreasing, that would also impact housing value because that's a source of demand that would be diminishing. And so I think there's a real focus here of thinking about how you ensure balance of maintaining attractiveness of Kiawah to all of these various groups of stakeholders. So with that, I'll pause for a moment because I know I've been talking for a while. We have some additional components we can walk through in terms of key themes, our SWOT analysis and the strategy toolkit, but do want to get any sort of initial comments or thoughts that you all have, or if you have any questions, make sure that we can pause and respond to those.
Any questions, anybody?
Stephen, the one question I would ask, early in the presentation, you had a slide that showed a 1.8% annual growth.
Mhm.
Is that relatively linear, or is that kind of choppy depending on whatever the market conditions are at the moment?
No, it is relatively linear, and has been fairly consistent since 2010 or 2011. Obviously, there were wider value swings during the recession itself, but in the recovery and since then, values have been fairly stable. And if helpful later on, we can dive into the sort of the full report and some of the graphs and tables that show that.
And the other question I'll ask is the last slide you showed, which talks about in the fifth box, the balance on short-term rentals.
Mm-hmm.
There was a robust debate last year about short-term rentals. In HRNA's opinion, are we in relative balance? Are we in a spot that's comfortable for the island's property values, or are we in some danger that we don't recognize?
Yeah, so we did a lot of analysis on STRs and looking at data on the impact of STRs on the housing market within Kiawah. We'll get into a lot more detail as we go through some of the key findings. But I would say as sort of the high level takeaways on that is, I think where Kiawah stands today with regard to short-term rentals and how that relates to the policy that was passed last year. Currently, the island is at about 17% STRs within single family areas, and specifically R1 and some select R2 zones. That share hasn't changed dramatically over time and remains below the 20% cap that was set last year. And so from what we've seen, there hasn't been any impact on values thus far because the cap has not been reached. And sort of the threat of potentially reaching the cap has not had an impact on housing values. If the cap is reached in the future, you could, that could limit future value growth, but wouldn't impact essentially where values stand today. But if and when you reach that point, could reassess. But based on the levels of STR operations that we see today, we don't see a value impact on the current market.
Okay, thank you.
I also want to, if I can highlight, Steve, there was a slide that you had a couple slides before that one that we talked about when you were talking about what the characteristics were of Kiawah, the experience. And if I understood from an earlier discussion, I thought it was interesting for the rest of the council that the understanding I had is that what you concluded is one of the most critical things that makes Kiawah sort of stand apart competitively is the diverse experience that people can have here. The fact that they can, in one place, you can satisfy a variety of different experiences that might be valuable to a different homeowner. So, you know, if somebody wants a great beach, there are other great beaches on the Atlantic coast. If somebody wants great golf, there are other places that have great golf. If you want a beautiful, you know, maritime forest, there are other maritime forests. If you want a great amenity, there are other places that have amenities. I thought one of the things that you concluded that was of interest is that one of the things that sets Kiowa aside is the fact that in this location, you can get them all. That in other places, you may go somewhere where golf is what they have. And if your family is looking for something broader than that in the experience, they don't get it. I hope I've understood correctly the conclusion you had there, but I thought that was an important takeaway in your assessment of the experience and strength of the island.
Yeah, that's right. And I appreciate you pointing that out. But yeah, that was a key part of what we found is exactly that, the, you know, sort of comprehensive package that exists in terms of, you know, the overall experience on Kiowa and what you can access. And to the mayor's point, you know, if there's one particular, you know, thing of interest to someone, you know, there's always going to be a better option. But when thinking about the sort of the comprehensive package as a whole and you know, various amenities, again, both, you know, natural, man-made, really what, you know, sets Kiowa apart and what we see is what drives interest for people to purchase on Kiowa.
Stephen, if I can, a comment and something to ask you to focus on as you go forward. Obvious to all of us who live here, and I'm sure to you too, across the country and certainly on Kiowa, the coronavirus has dramatically changed real estate markets and a lot of other things. I'm not sure any of us fully yet understand the long-term impact of the virus. Certainly the issue of working from home or working from a location that's not your principal place of business has become essential over the last 6 months, and maybe more so in the future, we don't know. My point is a little bit, I'm sure it's going to be very hard for us to begin to understand how this event impacts Kiowa long term. But to the extent you have any insight on it, it would be interesting to hear that as you go forward. We've all seen real estate sales go through the roof. Yeah. That's not likely to continue because we're going to run out of inventory in a minute. But it will be interesting to see whether or not we have any sense of how this may impact us long term. So just think about that as you go through that, because that's something that's on every property owner, every resident, every guest thought process, right?
Yeah, that is a great point and something that we have included in our analysis. So we'll get to in a little bit, but just to give you a brief summary of sort of the you know, what we've seen in the approach we've taken is, I think, recognizing the point you made, and that, you know, really no one knows the long-term prospects of what will come of this. You know, there's many different directions that this could take in terms of how the virus continues to play out, what the, you know, national response is, and then how that impacts, you know, broader economic conditions. So, you know, which is to say, I think we've been tracking in real time, you know, both for this work, but really all the work that we're doing is, you know, understanding the impacts of COVID has been a key part of what we're looking at. And, you know, Kiowa is clearly much better positioned than you know, nearly most any other place in terms of you know, the fact that it's become, you know, an attractive place for people to relocate for exactly the reasons that you pointed out. And so we've been monitoring that appeal, but also recognizing, you know, there likely is some limit to that, you know, that increased activity that's occurring, and wanting to understand the factors that will influence what the longer term impacts are. So although we don't know exactly how it will play out, we do know, you know, the key factors that will influence, and it will be critical to be keeping an eye on. And then based on that, then thinking about, we created a couple of scenarios, sort of hypotheticals of, based on certain outcomes within these key factors, what that might look like in terms of values. So we'll go through that, but to the extent that what we go through doesn't answer your question, happy to talk through it a bit further. Any other questions before we move forward?
Stephen, I have a question. I believe you referred to us as a residential lifestyle resort. Is that true?
Yeah, residential resort community.
Okay. And the other places that you compared Kiowa to,
Mhm.
Sea Isle, are they all also the same type of?
Yes. So we would consider all. So we actually created two sets of peer analyses. One with what were called direct peers, which were Sea Island,
Right.
Sea Pines, Palmetto Bluff, which we would consider to be residential resort communities and
Mhm.
sort of competing in the same space as Kiowa, at least regionally. But then we also looked at a broader set of peers that was more loosely defined, just based on what we considered to be high-end residential resort communities, where you had home values above $800,000 and a high share of seasonal usage. And so that included a broader group of peers, about 25 locations across the country. And that it was primarily sort of similar beach or golf communities, but also did include some sort of mountain resorts, such as Park City or other similar resort communities of that nature.
Okay, thank you.
So with that, we'll move into our key themes. And again, this is sort of intended to be a high-level summary of a lot of really extensive and in-depth analysis that we did. So this will present sort of the high points or key takeaways that we pulled, but happy to, again, go into more detail if you all do have any questions. But I think, the point in highlighting these key themes is to really understand how that fed into the SWOT analysis that we conducted. So, thinking about the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats that we perceive within the Kiowa Island housing market, and then how those then translate into the strategy toolkit of recommendations. So we'll walk through each of these key theme items now, starting first with housing metrics. And as I pointed out earlier, we conducted a really extensive analysis of housing metrics on Kiowa, and across almost all metrics, with the exception of lot values, we see the market exhibiting positive trends since 2010. So stable home values, which, as we pointed out, are about just under 2% a year in growth. Skipping lot values for a moment, which I'll come back to, but thinking about sales volume, construction volume, renovation activity and volume, the absorption of product, and all either slightly increasing or significantly increasing on an annualized basis. And I think really importantly, looking at the last line here, the peer comparison of home value. So how Kiowa is comparing to those direct peers that we mentioned, that we were just talking through, and that Kiowa has been outperforming them, which is a really positive sign within the space that the market operates. The one area that we did see some negative values or losses is on lot values, which declined during the recession, but have continued to decline some since then, have not really fully recovered. And that we see as being driven by a couple of reasons. The first is really inflated values leading up to the 2008 recession. So just by nature of the housing crisis and national conditions more broadly, sort of the overinflating of all real estate value, and in particular lot values. So that led to negative impacts in the wake of the recession. And then even since then, there's been really rapidly increasing construction costs. And something that we see is as construction costs rise, there tends to be a negative impact on the amount that people are willing to pay for land, sort of a corresponding feature where there's theoretically a sort of fixed price that someone can pay for construction of a new home. So as construction costs increase, you often see land values decrease. And so given rapidly rising construction costs that we've seen in recent years, we think that's also driving that decrease in values. When we look to reinvestment, this is an area that we generally consider to be really positive for Kiowa, in that there is a really active culture of reinvestment, both for the housing market, but also for facilities and infrastructure on the island. I guess first starting here with homes, the chart here shows the share of housing units that received a renovation permit by year, and it's broken out by single family homes and cottages and villas. And so what you see is a higher rate of reinvestment occurring for single family homes compared to cottages and villa stock. And this gets back at the more general point of sometimes the challenge that exists in shared ownership properties such as villas, in being able to get approval and support for larger scale renovation activity. And so that's not something that has necessarily been a large concern previously, but will continue to grow into the future as you think about sort of maintenance of all homes across the island. I know there have been some examples of reinvestment in villas that have taken place. I think the example that we've looked at is Duneside, but being able to think about how to encourage those types of reinvestments really across all housing stock is really critical in going forward.
Hey, Stephen, if I can interrupt, when you mentioned Duneside, you're actually referring to the exterior of that those buildings, not just the interior where someone's doing something in their kitchen or their living room. You're talking about the regime getting together and actually authorizing and taking assessment, I assume, to pay for an exterior upgrade. Is that correct? Yes,
and that is a good clarification to make. When I'm referencing the challenge that exists with shared ownership properties, it's really focused on exteriors or areas where it's a shared ownership component of the property. Obviously, any individual homeowner can update their kitchen or other interior components, and so that's sort of separate from what we see here, and likely a big portion of the reinvestment and renovation activity that you do see occurring.
And when you say shared ownership, you don't mean timbers. You mean a complex like Turtle Point Villas, right, that is a common complex, but person A owns one unit, person B owns the second unit. That's what you're referring to as shared ownership, correct?
Any condominium ownership structure would fall into that. So that's exactly right.
Okay, thank you.
And an example of the redevelopment, using Turtle Point as an example, is that several years ago we had a facade upgrade. Mm-hmm. So they went through each unit, and we have a new facade to help increase the value of the units.
Yeah, and that is sort of exactly what we're referring to in terms of making sure that you are encouraging that type of activity, right, which is beneficial, not only for the individual property itself, but more broadly for the island, as you're thinking about making sure that everyone is active in reinvestment. When thinking about amenity facilities in the context of reinvestment, again, this is an area that we see as generally positive, and across all of the sort of stakeholder entities on the island, we've seen recent reinvestment activity, capital expenditures across a number of facilities and a number of planned future investments as well. When you look at, Kika's recent sandcastle renovations, activity by the resort to develop the West Beach Conference Center, or make updates to the resort itself, Kiawah Partners activity in terms of renovations to the beach club, construction of Marsh House. These are all really positive things, and what we view as really critical, again, in maintaining that market health and generating interest in activity on the island. Construction costs are high and rising, and this is not unique to Kiawah. This is really a national trend, but is really important in thinking about how this impacts Kiawah, because there's sort of a dual context that exists, which is that construction costs are high and rising, but they are already higher on Kiawah relative to other locations in the region. So from interviews that we did and research that we conducted, we see about a 30% premium in construction costs on Kiawah relative to other sort of non-coastal locations in the Carolinas. Part of that is driven by Kiawah's location and sort of building codes that exist for storms and other sort of environmental components. But part of that is driven by just local market conditions. As you think about the sort of labor pool that exists for construction and its location, proximity to Kiawah, and other factors that sort of have an impact on overall costs. So there's been about a 25% increase in construction costs sort of across the board since 2015. And again, that is sort of compounded by the fact that there's already this premium that exists on Kiawah relative to elsewhere. One of the key sort of takeaways or implications that has is as you think about the cost of new construction relative to existing homes. So as we pointed out, home values have been growing modestly but relatively stable. New construction costs are increasing pretty rapidly, and so as the gap between that new construction cost and existing home price widens, it can serve to suppress the appeal of new construction relative to just purchasing an existing home.
So Stephen, based on that, your assessment would be that this differential would be driving, I mean, right now we're seeing a huge amount of new construction.
Mm-hmm.
And yet it would seem like then these numbers should be driving existing home sales. That I guess unless what we're not seeing in that is that the age and the condition of existing homes is going to require another X $100 per square foot for renovation.
Yeah, and there will always be some sort of balancing that occurs within the market. So if new construction costs were to increase dramatically, that will sort of spur people to move more towards existing homes. But to your point, as homes require more reinvestment in terms of renovations when people are moving into them, they're going to factor that into cost, and that will that could sort of push it the other way. So it's really just understanding that construction costs can impact not only new construction but also the existing housing market and how it plays out. New construction has been fairly active, even prior to COVID-19 on the island. It has really since only increased, from all the data that we have. So there's no reason to believe that construction costs are decreasing as a result of COVID, but it is something to continue monitoring in terms of sort of the broader impacts that has on this specific variable. When we look at Kiawah's competitive positioning and specifically looking at general housing market pricing and conditions, we see Kiawah is generally in line with peer communities from a pricing standpoint. And so we show here the median single family home pricing and then how that price compares on a per square foot basis, which is a really typical basis for looking at it within sort of a housing market conditions and assessment that we do from a research perspective. In looking at just overall prices, median single family prices on Keough are about $1.2 million today. That is above pricing on Palmetto Bluff and Sea Pines, but below the pricing that you see on Sea Island, where median prices are about 2.4 million. But I think the more important metric to us is really to understand how that equates on a per square foot basis and how Keough compares to peers in that regard. But again, you see similar trends where on a per square foot basis, Keough outperforming Palmetto Bluff, but being slightly below the pricing that you see on Sea Island.
And Stephen, I assume this is really resale. This doesn't capture the new properties that are built. Is that correct?
That is correct. You can also look at, in understanding competitive positioning and just Keough's relative market health, look at comparison of demographics to peer communities. And so what we found there is that Keough is wealthier than peer communities, which obviously bodes well for sort of general long-term market conditions and market health. But that the population on Keough is aging, and that is true not only for Keough but really for all these peer communities. Is that over time the median age has increased, and so you see Keough generally in line with these other peer communities of high 50s, low 60s as sort of the median age of owners on the island. But something we want to make sure stakeholders on the island are sort of responsive to going forward, in recognizing the need to make sure that you are remaining attractive to, again, future generations of buyers that will continue interest and maintain sort of currency and relevance for Keough.
Stephen, I have to point out that my average neighbors are doing better than I am.
So in terms of income,
I see in the footnote that comes from a survey. Is there any data that is based on census or anything else? I see two of the other three don't even have a number. So
yeah, so
up to access.
Yeah, so that's a great question, and I'm glad you asked it. So the data that we're showing here as it relates to income is based on owner surveys that were conducted, both on Keough and on Palmetto Bluff, and so that's the Keough Island study was conducted by Keough Island Real Estate, and is representative of an average income based on the responses that were provided, which, as you point out, is very high. There is separately data available through the census that we looked at that provides median incomes. But the challenge with that is that census data is only specific to full-time residents. So it's capturing just the full-time resident population, not all owners on the island. So the numbers there, and because it's also a median number rather than average number, it's less prone to sort of be skewed by any particularly large or small incomes. The overall median that we see is lower than the average shown here. It's about 150,000 for full-time residents, but the overall trends relative to peer communities don't change. That sort of same pattern exists for all of these communities. And again, the average income that we see on Keough is higher than the other locations and is wealthier.
And the median age of owners, that's all owners. Is that correct? And I think I saw later on in the appendix, the median age of full-time residents is higher than that. Is that where you're getting to your comment about we're getting old?
Yeah, so that's exactly right. We have the median age of all owners here, which is 62. Separately, we looked at the median age of full-time residents, which is around 68. And what led us to a lot of our findings is really understanding that change over time. So comparing the median age for those residents, we have data going back about 10 years. And so in that 10-year period, the median age of full-time residents increased from 63 to 68 years old of age.
Thank you.
And again, that it's something that, Kiowa is not unique in that regard. We see that occurring in other residential resort communities as well. A number of them have developed sort of responses to that in terms of how they market themselves, the product that they're offering, or different programs that they have in place. And so I think one of the key things that we're focused on is recognizing Kiowa's ability or potential to enact some similar types of policies, programs, marketing to really respond to that and ensure that you're attracting future generations.
Okay, thank you.
One of the other components that we looked at as part of our study was infrastructure, and even more specifically than that, understanding resiliency and the impact that has on the housing market. And so, as the mayor pointed out, there was a broader study that was done on flooding and sea level rise back in 2018. And so our intent was not to replicate that, but really to draw on that to understand implications that resiliency issues have on the housing market. When you look broadly, sort of nationally, at how people are thinking about climate change and sort of natural disaster impacts on housing, it is a pretty large factor in how they consider decisions around buying or selling a home. The graph here shows about almost 3/4 of people, 73%, are either somewhat or very much taking that into account when they are buying or selling a home. So despite the fact that Kiowa really benefits from an accreting beach and is generally much better positioned in that regard than many other coastal communities, the notion or idea that it could be susceptible to resiliency challenges alone, like even if it is better positioned, that notion could impact potential buyers' decisions. And so it's really important not only to make sure that stakeholders on Kiowa are being proactive about addressing those challenges that have been identified, but also that you're then communicating that externally to essentially market it as a competitive positioning point of Kiowa relative to other places, and how Kiowa is better positioned. On marketing, we talked through this a little bit at the top of the conversation, but just to sort of go through this again quickly, we looked at formal marketing channels that exist on Kiowa and broke it out really into 4 components of lifestyle marketing, brokerage marketing, visitor marketing, and then other marketing that occurs. So lifestyle marketing is really focused on the sort of creating awareness of Kiowa in general, sort of general advertising of the island and attracting visitors and prospective buyers. Brokerage marketing really focuses on specific home sales. So as someone is listing a home for sale, doing marketing related to that specific home sale. Visitor marketing, which is really driven by the resort, STR owners and operators, and the Andel Inn, but is focused on attracting visitors to the island. And then other marketing that occurs, which is primarily through the town's state accommodation tax allocation, which it then allocates externally to the resort, to Freshfields, to local nonprofit entities and others, but all sort of focused on attracting visitors, bringing awareness to Kiowa. As I mentioned a bit earlier, I think one of the key challenges here will be in the future as the island approaches sellout and Kiowa Partners has a sort of decreased role in the lifestyle marketing that occurs on the island, how you make sure that you are maintaining that and driving formal marketing in a way that will continue to attract and drive interest in Kiowa. And then on the topic of short-term rentals, we covered this a bit earlier, but I'll try and go through it a bit more in depth now. And to the extent that you have questions, please do let me know. But we, as I mentioned, we conducted a pretty in-depth analysis in terms of understanding market performance of short-term rentals on Kiowa Island, how that's driving value in terms of revenue generation for homes that are operating as short-term rentals, and then what the sort of corresponding impacts of that are. I think we've done short-term rental analysis in a number of locations across the country, and particularly as it has become sort of a more prominent issue in recent years with the rise of platforms such as Airbnb or VRBO. I think the key differentiator that we see in Kiowa relative to a lot of other places where we do this work is the relatively stable nature of short-term rentals over time, which is sort of the in place given the nature of Kiowa as a residential resort community. Going back to the early 2000s, the total share of STRs in single-family areas was about 15%. Today it is around 17%. So the share of sort of visitors or short-term rentals as a portion of the overall housing stock hasn't changed really significantly. Of course, there has been additional home construction in that time, so that the total number of short-term rentals has increased, but the share that they make up is relatively similar. Kiowa has always had some component of visitors, and that existed, previously, prior to a lot of these new platforms, and it continues to exist today. Many other markets that we've worked in are locations where you see dramatic changes in the number of STRs and the share of STRs. So neighborhoods or communities that previously had no STRs prior to Airbnb being in place, and have experienced just total sort of flip of the dynamic of the market, where you have investor operators coming in and buying up properties, and the share of STRs in place being 40-50% of total units in the market. And that's where you see really dramatic changes in the dynamics and behavior of a market in terms of value. Oftentimes, increasing dramatically initially as you have these investor owners coming in, but then oftentimes then reaching a tipping point where, because of the high share of short-term rentals in place, there being a decreased attractiveness to full-time residents.
Stephen, sorry, just very quickly for clarification, the 15 and 17% numbers for Kiowa for STRs, did you derive that by just looking at the total number of short-term rental permits, or did you look at some number of what homes were actually rented?
So we have data on both. So we have the permit data from the town in terms of those that are officially registered with the town, and that's the 17% number that I mentioned. The data sources that we use also track sort of listings that are on place on platforms like Airbnb, VRBO, other locations. So we're also able to look at the total listings that we see there. The only complicating factor with that is that those don't provide an exact address. They only provide sort of approximate coordinates or locations. And so given the division of Kiowa, and the restrictions that are in place between, only applying to R1 and R2 areas, which are essentially single family zonings, it's not always possible to see whether a listing is, in that R1, R2 area or not in that R1, R2 area. We can get a general breakout, but it's not 100% exact. But the short answer to your question is that the 17% number is based on the permits that are in place with the town.
Okay, thank you.
But yeah, so I think just getting back to sort of the points here. So Kiowa is at 17% today. It has not yet hit the 20% cap in sort of the single family residential areas. And based on the analysis that we conducted, we don't, as a result of that, we don't see any value impacts at this point in terms of that changing market behavior or correspondingly market values. And we don't see it the market being at any sort of tipping point today, where the presence of STRs that are in place is negatively impacting housing values. And again, this sort of gets back to the fact that as the overall share of short-term rentals has been relatively consistent. So you're not seeing large-scale investor owners come in. You're not seeing things that really would impact the overall dynamics of the market to be different than it has been historically. And that's really what drives the fact that we don't see impacts to value today, or that you've really hit this tipping point, as you see in some other markets. But again, this is something to continue monitoring over time. And I think based on our discussions with the town, there are mechanisms in place to sort of continue monitoring this into the future, to just make sure that you are supporting the financial opportunities that exist with short-term rentals, but also recognizing the quality of life factors, and again that you're maintaining interest for driving interest for a broad set of stakeholders that includes residents and visitors.
Stephen, you skipped by the bullet, or I missed it, on the STR revenues do not support owner investors. And I assume that goes back to, the numbers here look large, but they're gross numbers. So
Right. That's
when,
important.
when you get to a net number, I assume the assessment here is that that the marginal gain to the rentals on average is not huge. I see the individual numbers, and I know, of course, we have homes that individually, are sometimes 3 or 4 times this, but large numbers of them aren't even up to the 39,000 gross. So
Absolutely.
And there's additional detail on this in the full report, but that is a good point to clarify. Is we don't see this. Market conditions don't support investor owners on a large scale. When considering the revenue that you can generate relative to the pricing of properties, we conducted an analysis that compared the revenues to the costs associated with essentially operating an STR and having a mortgage and other costs associated with home ownership. And there really is not a market in place just based on where pricing is to support that large scale investor owner structure.
Even you were pretty clear that in other markets, not only have large scale investor owners have taken those markets over, and I assume they only do that because they can make money. What is it that makes Kiowa financially, on balance, unattractive for larger numbers of owner investors?
So it's that the residential market is really what's driving the pricing, and the pricing, because there's strong pricing in the residential market, there's not an opportunity to, as an investor owner, to make money. So where you see those huge shifts are places where, most typically it's where housing values are relatively low, but you're near or in a visitor-centric location. So we did this analysis in New Orleans. This is a really great example where, adjacent to the French Quarter, home values are relatively low and modest, but it's a 10-minute walk from the French Quarter. And so as you had the rise of these platforms, there was a recognition that operating these units as a short-term rental is far, far, far more accretive than the value that you can get, within the existing housing market there. And so that's where you then see the investor owners coming in, because pricing on Kiowa is relatively high to begin with, and that pricing is really dictated by the residential market rather than the visitor market. That's why you don't see that large scale investor activity. You have people operating short-term rentals, but it's really as a supplementary source of income rather than the sort of primary decision behind why they are purchasing a home in the first place.
Stephen, isn't one of the big drawbacks that tax structure? I mean, second homes here are very expensive.
Yes, and I think we have a point that we'll get into actually on the next slide if we want to jump to that.
It sets you up perfect.
Yeah, beautiful segue. Yeah, so I think that this does play into short-term rental attractiveness, but I think there are more general implications to draw on thinking about the cost of homeownership on Kiowa relative to other locations. So this is focused on beyond just the price point of purchasing a home. What does it actually cost to own a property sort of on an annualized basis? Thinking about both property taxes that exist, but also assessments for amenities and other features. And so when you look at property taxes, Kiowa there's sort of two components to it. That's driven by the fact that in South Carolina, there's a differentiation between property tax rates for primary homeowners versus second homeowners. So for primary homeowners, Charleston County has among the lowest effective tax rates, property tax rates in the country. And so that obviously is very beneficial for Kiowa in terms of being very competitive relative to peers in terms of pricing on property taxes. So we have an example here showing a $1 million priced home and what the sort of costs are then associated with property taxes and assessments. And so if you're a primary owner, your property tax rate on that $1 million home is about $3,900 annually, which is lower than any of the peers that we looked at. The challenge that comes into play, and what Chris was getting at in his comment, is for secondary homeowners or non-primary residents who are paying a higher tax rate. And the effective rate there is much higher and puts Kiowa at a disadvantage relative to other states where that differentiation between primary and secondary owners doesn't exist. And so if you're a secondary owner on Kiowa, that same $1 million house would have a property tax of just under $14,000. And again, you can compare that then sort of across these other locations where it starts to look less competitive. And that, to Chris's point, has implications for short-term rentals in that, if you are operating it primarily as a short-term rental that is not your primary residence, you're going to be paying that higher tax rate, and it makes it less attractive as an investment opportunity. On the assessment side, we looked at assessments that are put in place primarily through KICA, the Community Association, which are about $2,600 a year, generally, but with increases above that in a couple locations on the island. And we view those as pretty competitively priced. And general surveys that we've seen on the island show that residents are relatively comfortable with that pricing in terms of the value that they're getting out of that. It's slightly higher than assessments on Sea Pines, but lower than Palmetto Bluff and Sea Island. And that's driven really by the sort of difference in structure that exists between Kiowa and those locations in terms of the amenity bases. So on Sea Island and Palmetto Bluff, all residents or owners are members of the private club that exists there and essentially have access to the full set of sort of amenities that are built into that. And so that's why you see higher assessment rates there relative to the rate that exists on Kiowa. And I think that has some separate implications that we'll get into, but is worth pointing out in this context as well. And then lastly, within the key themes, and getting back to a point or a question that you brought up earlier, Dan, is the question about COVID-19 and the impacts that we're seeing. And so obviously the full impacts and economic ramifications of COVID are not yet fully known, but we do know that the pandemic will create ripple effects within the housing market. And you've already seen that in a really positive way in terms of the increased market activity that has taken place in recent months. And so while the island really has benefited in the short term from that, there's a lot of uncertainty that exists in the future in terms of how long that increased interest will last, or what other broader conditions may change or influence the long-term impacts of COVID. And so we identified 5 key factors here, and based on this, developed a couple of sort of example scenarios to show, based on how a couple of these play out, what that might look like in terms of positive or negative impacts on the Kiowa housing market. But at a broad level, you'll first look at economic impacts, particularly at the national level, and how the broader national economy is performing. And even in particular with that, focusing on performance of the stock market, which is where a lot of the demographic that is driving market activity on Kiawah is relying on wealth to make these types of purchases. Impacts on unemployment or other sort of metrics, while important in sort of having implications for the broader economy, tend to impact prospective buyers on Kiawah less than sort of the general population as a whole. But recognizing the way the national economy goes will have some impact on Kiawah going forward. Second is really the ongoing appeal of vacation homes and sort of what we would call retreat locations. Again, Kiawah has tremendously benefited from that in the short term, but the extent to which that is able to last into the future, or how deep that market is, will have impacts going into the future. Third, the safety and availability of travel. So a lot of the analysis that we did showed that Kiawah is not just a regional market in terms of attracting buyers or people with second homes. Really, attracts people broadly from the East Coast. And so the extent to which there's a continued restriction or even just lack of desire to travel will change the dynamics of the market. And so you're likely to see fewer people coming from New York or New Jersey or other locations like that, but potentially more interest from people in Charlotte or other locations, sort of within driving distance, where people, you generally feel much safer in being able to travel and get to more easily. And then the last two, general consumer confidence and interest rates, again, relate more broadly to national economic conditions, but will have impacts in terms of housing values on Kiawah and general market health of how the market is responding to the overall national condition.
Do we have any data I haven't seen any that this recent increase in sales that we think is COVID related, whether that is skewed towards part-time versus full-time ownership? In other words, is it people living up in more riskier areas who are saying, okay, this is the time I want to invest in a second home somewhere where I can get away from New York or get away from New Jersey if it's not safe? Or whether these are people who are actually making just relocation decisions, or do we not know?
Yeah, so we don't have specific information that sort of breaks that out quantitatively in terms of share of full-time versus part-time owners. We do have data, which I'm sure you've seen as well, on home sales through the end of the second quarter of this year, which are very, very, very active, and the market is performing very well. I think you could look to real estate brokers that are active on the island, just sort of anecdotally in terms of what they're seeing of where people are coming from, what their intention is in terms of full-time residents versus part-time residents, and the reason behind that. We don't have that broken out in any sort of quantitative way, at least at this point. So that ends the key themes portion of our discussion. Again, I want to pause to see, I know we had discussion points and questions that emerged from a couple of different points, but if there are any other questions or topics people want to raise before we then move into sort of implications that we generated through our SWOT.
I would just make sure you're looking at the clock. I know
Yes.
You've got a fair amount of slides still coming on the SWOT side of the world,
Yes.
which is somewhat detailed. So
yeah, I was just going to point that out as well. And I think recognizing that we can go through the SWOT analysis, maybe try and go through it relatively quickly. So I think it would be good to spend some time on the strategy toolkit and specific sort of action items that emerged from that.
good. Okay.
So with that, I'll try and breeze through the section pretty quickly, but again, do feel free to pause or ask questions as you have any. So we conducted a SWOT analysis to really, with the goal of sort of serving as a bridge between a lot of the in-depth and detailed, market analysis and engagement that we did with the ultimate action items and recommendations. And so our goal was to sort of distill everything that we saw within our analysis to understand what we viewed as, the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats as they exist and pertain to the Kiowa housing market today. And so we can start in just talking about the strengths. And for each of these, we've sort of categorized them within the same framework that we established up front, which is the sort of 4 key drivers of physical assets, experience, marketing and branding, and investment value. And so I'll just run through each of these briefly. But starting with strengths and at the top with physical assets, recognizing the strong culture of active capital investment that exists on the island, so the reinvestment that we see taking place today, both for housing and for facilities, is very positive and something that will be important to maintain going forward. Within experience, recognizing the incomparable location and environment of Kiowa and what it offers relative to peer communities, and thinking about that really comprehensive package of amenities and services and sort of the just general environment that exists that makes us a place that people want to be. And that's informed by really top tier flagship amenities. There is, a differentiator of Kiowa from other places is sort of opt-in nature that exists in terms of the level of amenities that people have access to. So if you are a homeowner on Kiowa, you have access to KICA amenities, or community association amenities, which would be the Sandcastle facility and also other sort of general facilities on the island. You can also opt into additional amenity facilities through either the Governor's Club or the Kiowa Island Club, which does allow for sort of variation in terms of people selecting and then correspondingly paying for the level of amenities that they are sort of most interested in. There are some negatives to that, which we'll get to in a minute, but having that sort of stratification is beneficial in terms of allowing people to choose the level of amenities that are interesting to them.
Now, to be clear, when you say opt-in, they can't opt into the club unless their property is capable of that, and they have to make that decision at the time of acquisition, correct?
Correct. But it would more so, when they're making that decision, if they know that their interest is to purchase a property with, club membership, that they can do that. And then lastly, under experience, just recognizing the wealthy population of Kiowa, particularly relative to peer locations, and the benefits that creates in terms of supporting a healthy housing market. Under marketing and branding, the well-established name, brand, and market premium that exists on Kiowa, and its sort of positioning that it's had over time, the recognition that it has in where it stands. The fact that the visitors to the sanctuary and the island short-term rentals create a sort of natural source of exposure of the island to prospective buyers, and that's a key differentiator that you see is looking at communities that have a resort presence versus those that don't, and the benefits that it provides in terms of bringing new people to the island that may not otherwise be there, and based on that experience that they have, potentially creating prospective buyers over the long term. And then lastly, just the nature of the Kiowa Island Club, increasing the desirability of Kiowa. So within our fuller analysis, we saw a general premium that exists for pricing of properties with a Kiowa Club membership, and the nature of sort of what that drives in terms of creating value and again, desirability of people wanting to locate on Kiowa. Under investment value, home values had outperformed the national market in recent years, which is very positive and good when thinking about how Kiowa is comparing to other locations. You have a healthy short-term rental market that does support home values and provide a source of demand for housing units. And property tax rates are among the lowest in the country, which for full-time owners is beneficial. Jumping over to weaknesses, sort of the less fun side, under physical assets, reinvestment hurdles for villas due to their shared ownership structure. I think we've covered that pretty thoroughly already, but just recognizing that as a potential weakness in the long-term health of the market. The fact that parts of the island are susceptible to current and future flooding risks, and a number of these were identified within the 2018 report that the town conducted. And while there have been, the town and community association and others have been active in making investments based on the findings of that report, just recognizing the need to continue being responsive to those changes over time and ensuring infrastructure is in place to mitigate any potential challenges. Within the experience, the nature of split amenity facilities between the Kiawah Island Club, the Governor's Club, and non-club can create a perception of residents not having access. And this gets to sort of the flip side of what I was just talking about of the opt-in nature of amenities on Kiawah, is that there is a differentiation of amenity levels that exists. And so while if you were to strictly compare the community association's amenities to the amenities of the community association in peer communities, Kiawah performs very well. But for residents that don't have access to the Kiawah Island Club or may choose not to access Governor's Club amenities, the amenities that they have relative to other peer locations where all owners have access to all amenities does create a sort of a split level of interest and a disadvantage for those owners relative to what they could get in other locations from an amenity facility perspective.
Stephen, do you have a number or a rough handle on what % of owners, be they residents or otherwise, on Kiawah fall into that category, i.e. are not club or Governor's Club members?
So I don't know the numbers off the top of my head, but we do have data on sort of what that breakout looks like. And then separately, you can also look at the share of full-time residents versus second homeowners, which will also dictate sort of the level of interest that people have in community association amenities relative to other amenities on the island. But we can follow up with that data in terms of.
I'd be interested in seeing the number. I would also point out that I think when we sort of mix the Governor's Club and the Kiawah Island Club, I think that is a little misleading. The Kiawah Island Club is at this point a somewhat scarce commodity. You can't just buy a property and be assured that you get into the Kiawah Island Club. So there will certainly be owners who can't access that. The Governor's Club, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe is, if you put down your money, you're in, right? So people who don't belong to the Governor's Club don't belong out of their own free will.
Correct. But I think a lot of what we looked at emerges from the nature, there has been an interest from a share of residents in enhancing community association amenities in recent years. And I think there's been a vote and some other initiatives that have been undertaken in terms of how to enhance those amenities relative to peer locations and ensure that residents that aren't members of the Kiawah Island Club or the Governor's Club can have sort of a baseline of amenity services that is competitive. And that's really where that derives from. And we'll get into that a little bit with the action items as well, but I think it is an important point to bring up. On the sort of related to that, and this is the second point here, the amenity structure can cause confusion for potential future buyers, and so having to explain the difference between community association amenities versus Governor's Club amenities versus Kiawah Island Club amenities, while that can be done, it's a bit less straightforward than other locations where there's just a package of set amenities that are in place. Under investment value, we've talked through the declining unimproved lot values. Owner perceptions of values are impacted by the timing of their purchase. This is something we haven't talked through much yet, but just recognizing that any individual's perspective on sort of where the housing market is often tied to when they purchase their property. And so we did an analysis to understand what that looks like for owners on Kiowa relative to when they purchased. And if you purchased in 2006 at the height of the bubble, obviously you're not in as good a position today from a value perspective as someone who purchased, say, in 2016 and has seen relatively stable growth over the last couple of years. So that positioning really impacts how people view their purchase. And then lastly,
I have one more question. Sorry about the lots. Did I not read somewhere in the study that the declining lot value is not across the lots broadly, but is heavily driven by sort of inland, non-ocean view type lots?
correct.
Did you write that somewhere?
Correct.
Can that be bifurcated somehow? I mean, is there an analysis to be done that says, well, there's just a whole bunch of lots that are simply not that attractive and that are declining. On the other hand, if I think about lots in places like Ocean Park and so on and so forth, I wonder if they're declining in value.
Yeah, so we have that data, and we've tried to bifurcate. So want to make sure that the sample size is large enough in terms of the values that we're looking at. And so because there are a limited number of properties for sale, we tried to make sure that any way we were breaking it up was still a reasonable way of doing so. So we looked at the differentiation between ocean view or non-ocean view. We have the data to be able to bifurcate it in other ways, but you just want to make sure that you're looking at sort of a large enough sample size of properties. If you want to jump to the next page on opportunities, under physical assets, diversified product types, which gets back to the notion of the fact that the Kiowa's population is aging and the ability to potentially think about diversified product types that could attract younger buyers. And so that can be, you have examples of that sort of currently in place with the Timbers fractional ownership property. You could also look to new villa construction, which has been relatively limited on the island really since the 90s, or also just different types of home construction. So maintaining sort of high-end construction of new homes, but the homes that are perhaps slightly smaller than what has historically been built on the island, again, to attract and expand a buyer pool that brings younger buyers to the island. The second point is just bringing an amenity facility and senior living facility. So providing sort of these types of amenities just to increase the overall attractiveness in terms of the services that Kiowa offers. Under experience, just the fact that there are some aging amenity facilities. So while there's generally a strong reinvestment level that's occurring, and we have seen reinvestment activity, you want to just be monitoring this over time to ensure that as amenity facilities are aging, that you're continuing to reinvest in them. Under marketing and branding, thinking through the allocation of state accommodation tax funds, and specifically those that are generated currently to regional partners. And so there's opportunity, if there's a need to increase lifestyle marketing to maintain current levels, that you could create a nonprofit entity on Kiowa that is really focused on Kiowa specifically and driving a lot of that lifestyle marketing that attracts new visitors or prospective owners and brings awareness to the island. And then lastly, under marketing and branding, just recognizing the exposure and reputational benefits that will come into play from the 2021 PGA Championship. And then lastly, on opportunities under investment value, just the COVID-19 is driving near-term market activity, and so there's opportunity to really capitalize that in terms of ensuring strong marketing that again captures that increased market demand while it's occurring. And then lastly, under threats, under physical assets, the long-term resiliency impacts that will take place on the island and the need to address them, high and rising construction costs, increasing options for both different product types and recognizing the sort of challenges that may come into play in terms of competing with newer master plan communities. Under experience, the increasing age of Kiowa, which we've covered, and the amenity gap that exists between Kiowa Island Club and non-Kiowa Island Club, potentially impacting long-term home values for non-club members. Under marketing and branding, reducing marketing by Kiowa partners at sellout, which again creates a need for replacing that lifestyle marketing that will go away. And under investment values, sort of recognizing the long-term impacts of COVID on the national economy and how that could have implications, either positive or negative, for Kiowa, and just making sure to sort of prepare and brace for that. So walk through those very quickly. If there are any questions, I can pause to answer them, but do want to also make sure we have time to walk through some of our strategy toolkit action items as well. All right, so we'll go ahead and proceed. Within our strategy toolkit, we developed a set of action items, again, within the framework of these 4 drivers of housing market activity. I'll re-emphasize that these are really in response to what we identified based on our SWOT analysis and strategies that we think could be effective in addressing challenges, leveraging strengths, and whatnot. But that these are not necessarily anything that has been endorsed by the town or by other stakeholders on the island. This is really us making a set of recommendations on what we think could address what we identified. And if we want to flip to the next page, we can start going through them. There's a number of specific action items, and I don't know that we'll have time to go through all of them specifically or individually, but I will call a couple of important components out. When we're thinking about physical assets, we've broken this out into reinvestment and new development. When we look at reinvestment, it's particularly important to think about exterior villa reinvestment, which again, I know we've covered at a couple of different points, but specifically around that is really thinking about how you leverage financial incentives to encourage that type of reinvestment. So could you establish a facade program? Could you incentivize a reduction in assessment fees? Could you look to sort of traditional loan or grant programs supported by town or KICA reserves? But how do you create financial incentive that will encourage people to proceed with those reinvestments in a way that they may not otherwise be inclined to do? Under renovation permitting, we've made a note about seeking to decrease ARB deposits and fees. So for the Architectural Review Board, when you're seeking a permit for renovation or reinvestment of any kind, trying to reduce that fee to lower the hurdle for reinvestment, and generally encouraging people to go through the proper channels and move forward with reinvestment activity. Under new development, thinking about housing, shifting oversight of the Architectural Review Board from where it currently sits within Kiowa Partners to either KICA or the town once the island reaches sellout. And this is fairly typical across master plan communities, where when they're initially built, architectural review generally lies within the realm of the owner and developer. But as those communities are sell out and are sort of move toward more of a completion standpoint, they shift to either community association or local jurisdiction control, just to align with sort of general interests going forward. And so while this is not something that needs to happen immediately, it is something to consider in time as the island reaches sellout. I'm going to go to the next page. Under experience, we broke this out between competitive positioning of Kiowa relative to other places, and then getting more specific to the amenities, facilities, and services that exist on Kiowa. Under competitive positioning, we've made a recommendation to conduct a competitive positioning evaluation every 5 years, to be led by KICA, but with support really from the full set of stakeholders on the island. And again, this is really intended to recognize that Kiowa has historically been a market leader, but in order to continue doing so will require understanding what other communities are doing and how Kiowa is competitively positioned, and ensuring that Kiowa is responding to that as necessary. And that really feeds into a lot of this, the sort of amenity, facility, and services discussion, where based on that competitive positioning evaluation, Kiowa can create a really formalized phased reinvestment plan for amenity facilities that helps ensure across all stakeholders that there's an active role and intent in reinvesting in facilities, and that all stakeholders are sort of acting in the collective interest of the broader Kiowa community in reinvesting in these properties over time. The second bullet point here is focused on expanding users in the base of support for KICA amenities. So thinking about community association amenities like the Sandcastle facility, recognizing the desire that's existed in recent years to enhance those amenities, but the lack of broad support that there's been in terms of being able to gather the support needed to create additional assessments or get the votes needed to sort of address that and sort of close the amenity gap that exists today. There's a need to understand how you can expand that user base in order to drive interest in actually doing that. The alternative being that amenities will generally remain sort of in place where they are today, which if that's what residents choose, then that is fine. But it's sort of responding to the identified amenity gap that has been called out by the community association and others, but has not been able to generate the support needed to drive that on a really large scale.
Even if I may interrupt, this recommendation got some discussion on the listserv on Kiowa in the last few days. Your suggestion or recommendation that you expand the users to really non-owners is what I think the recommendation was. The purpose of that was to create money to fund expansion. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. Is essentially thinking about how do you broaden the base of support such that will generate revenue and create sort of a broader coalition of people that are interested in enhancing those amenity spaces.
So your comment that that certainly if KICA members don't want to do that, which I think certainly what the initial feedback is, then they really have a couple of choices, which is to stay with what they've got. If everyone's comfortable with it, that's wonderful. Or to increase their own fees in order to pay for expanded amenities. That's really the options we've got. Have I captured that correctly?
Yep, that's exactly right. It's really about assessing the options that you have. If there is a desire to enhance the amenity facilities in any way, sort of thinking about what are the options in terms of how you may do that. So you can essentially leave amenities as they are today and sort of maintain status quo. You can look to how you generate additional revenue, whether through additional assessments on owners or through expanding the user base to generate revenue. So yeah, this is not to say that this is a mandate that we're passing down. It's more so recognizing that sort of understanding that field of options and recognizing what a strategy would look like in order to enhance amenities if that is the desire.
And that's strictly a KICA decision.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Within marketing and branding, we looked at action items around lifestyle marketing and also the aging population on Kiowa. Within lifestyle marketing, as I alluded to earlier, we made a recommendation on establishing a nonprofit entity that could receive a portion of the state accommodation tax funding that is required currently to be provided to a nonprofit, but it currently goes to a regional partner. And so by bringing more of that to a Keough specific entity, that would allow maintaining of lifestyle marketing in a more concrete way that is specific to Keough's direct interests. And this is something that would be likely established by the town, but would likely include representation and sort of board membership of various stakeholders that would really contribute to how this is shaped and how that would look going forward.
Is it fair to say, Steve, though, we don't know what the partners spend on lifestyle marketing, although we know it's quite a bit. It's probably fair to say, though, that as good an idea as this may be, it by itself is never going to come close to replacing the amount of money that's expended today on regional, national marketing of Kiawah Island.
Yeah, so that I think both of the points you make are correct. We don't know the exact amount that Keough Partners is spending today on just sort of general lifestyle marketing. We do know, we do have data, obviously, of course, on the state accommodation tax, how much that generates, and what could potentially be put forth toward a nonprofit that essentially markets the island. Our perception is that it would be less than what the partners are spending today, but I think that's a really this we see as a really critical starting point in at least maintaining some level of that lifestyle marketing and ensuring that core components of that can continue and that you do have that formal marketing channel to attract people.
Okay.
Under the aging population category, our action items are focused on exploring opportunities to attract new generations of buyers through both the marketing efforts that take place, but also through housing type diversity. Additionally, the second point focuses specifically on the Kiawah Island Club and the sort of legacy membership that currently exists, but from our understanding is not very well marketed in terms of allowing options for sort of junior membership for people under the age of 40 or 45. This is something that we see a number of other communities doing and has been relatively effective in terms of attracting a younger base of users to the private club, but then that having a corresponding impact on benefiting the broader housing market and those that are purchasing homes. So we're reevaluating that and ensuring that there's a strong promotion of that to attract younger members.
Yeah, that's a problem though, because that runs counter to the idea that we want to offer lots and houses with memberships, right? If you bring in lots more junior members, great idea, but that bumps us up against the limits for the club.
Yeah, so and that's a great point, because that isn't a specific challenge that's in place in other communities in terms of club membership necessarily being tied to specific property ownership. But there is a legacy membership that exists today for the KI Club that is tied to people that have been members at some point in their families and others. So I think given that there is a legacy membership that exists today, I think that's less of a hurdle than we initially at least viewed it as, but would require thinking about how that ties to the current requirements and regulations around property ownership. And then lastly, under investment value, we looked at both short-term rentals and COVID-19 impacts. I think we've covered both of these pretty extensively already, but just to reiterate, under short-term rentals, action is really focused on continuing to monitor the growth and effects of STRs, particularly if they approach the current 20% cap that's in place within the designated single-family zones. And just with COVID-19, it's increasing and capitalizing on marketing in the short term to really capture as much market potential as possible, given the increased interest that exists right now. So I will stop there. I know, like the SWOT analysis, went through that very quickly, just in the interest of covering all content. But to the extent that there are comments or questions, want to make sure that we do respond to those.
Stephen, if you had to sum it up in the phrase I've heard before is elevator pitch.
Mm-hmm.
Can you give me a 30 or 45-second thing as to how Kia was doing?
I'm sorry, what was the last part of that?
Can you give me a 30 or 45-second pitch as to what your conclusion is? How are we doing on property values? How are we positioned?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, essentially it covers sort of the first 2 or 3 slides that we went through up front, which is really that, you know, Kiawah Island is it's a top tier residential resort community, and it has established a market premium over time relative to other locations and has a really strong market position. You see that reflected in the housing market values and overall housing market conditions, which have been very healthy, particularly since the recession. There were, obviously, all locations across the country suffered during the recession, and Kia was no exception to that. But I think the sort of competitive positioning of Kiawah is that it sort of suffered less during the recession and emerged stronger, and has continued to outperform peers based on our analysis. And so, while there are challenges that exist, we generally see the market is positioned very well. The really key thing is going to be being proactive about future challenges as you are reaching this critical point in time where the island is maturing and you are approaching sellout, ensuring that you are being proactive about these specific challenges that we did identify, and more proactive than stakeholders have probably necessarily been in the past. In that, previously it could be sort of easy to sort of rest on your laurels, but going forward, that will become harder and harder to do. And it's going to require really coordinated action between all of the stakeholder entities and really everyone, on the island, in terms of really addressing these future challenges and being proactive about it, today, not addressing it 5-10 years from now when it becomes a larger issue. So that's thinking about, driving reinvestment, maintaining competitive positioning, sustaining lifestyle marketing, attracting future generations of buyers, and continuing to sort of balance the STR market.
I would personally, and I don't want to put you on the spot, but I would love to have you guys come back after you've put some thought into this and say, these are all told, our 5 top strategy recommendations.
Mm-hmm.
Top 5.
Yeah, I think
not quite David Letterman, but just top 5. Without differentiating between all your this and that, just the top 5 recommendations that you as a firm with your experience believe could have the most meaningful impact on enhancing the housing market on Kiawah.
Yeah, so if we jump back to page 9, I think that really breaks down in the most simple way what we view as sort of the top recommendations or areas to be paying attention to, which is essentially what I just talked through. But the sort of 5 components of driving reinvestment, maintaining competitive positioning, ensuring you have a continued source of lifestyle marketing, attracting future generations of buyers, and balancing STRs. Those are what we view as really the top 5 things that the town and all stakeholders on the island really should and need to be proactive about.
Yeah, Stephen, that's not what I meant. Sorry, with respect. Those are goals. Those are strategic objectives.
Yep.
No, I meant in your strategy toolkit.
Oh, okay.
When you make a bunch of recommendations,
yep.
What are, when you leave all the different, you don't differentiate it by all your various factors, but what do you think, does your firm think would be the 5 things that one of the stakeholders, maybe it's the town, maybe it's Kika, maybe it's the partners or the resort, could do to have the most meaningful impact? That's what I was asking.
Yep.
And again, I suspect you'll want to think about that.
Yeah, so I think I would note now within the full body of the report, we provide some additional detail and talk about the sort of relative importance in terms of whether specific action items are low, medium, or high impact. But happy to follow up within sort of even more condensed version of that to say here are the top 5 things as we see them.
Great.
All right, I know we're at the end of our 2 hours, and we're gonna, as a council, again, this is on our agenda. This, we're gonna be having ongoing conversations on this, both with the town council and then with Kika and with other entities. So this is on our agenda for town council next Tuesday. We also have a couple opportunities here in between where we're going to have the ability to hear comments and questions from property owners. So, we're going to have the opportunity here to continue to talk about and dig into this in different ways. I realize this is a lot of data to look at in 2 hours. It can be kind of mind numbing, but you have to start somewhere. So Steve, I appreciate first the overview. And I think, I'd ask all the council members, it's clear, I know you all have gone through this data. When you get into the appendix, there are pages and pages of data in there with some interesting observations. So if you could continue to think about it and look at it, and we will be again talking about this next week in our council meeting. Any other questions for Steve?
No, Mayor.
No, but thank you, both Steve and Kelly. Very helpful to us. I appreciate you going through it.
And Steve, you have any other, or Kelly, any other comments? Otherwise, I have one more, and then I'll sign us off.
No, just that we really appreciate everyone taking the time today. And as you pointed out, we know this is a lot of information. We've tried to really break it down as much as we can, but even recognize that is still a lot of information to digest. So as there is any additional, if there's additional questions that you have, or as it's helpful to discuss any further, happy to do that. And then we'll also have the public session early next week where we can talk through it a bit further and address specific questions that people may have.
And obviously, my goal at some point here, as we talk through this, is to get to the point that I think you've raised. Right now we're sort of up at the 20,000 foot level. We've got a lot of information, a lot of potential issues, but now we've got to sort of dig down in sort of high grade what's important, what's critical, into whom. The last comment I just wanted to make, I meant to make it to begin with, is I really do want to also thank Chris Wyduck and Stephanie Tillerson on this study. I think, as you all know, they have put in hours and hours of work in leading this forward with HRNA. They have been both working closely with them in a large number of meetings and discussions and going over the material. They have been the primary interface with the Kika and the resort and the developers and real estate agents and residents. They have put a huge amount of time into this, and we would not be looking at it today without the effort that they put into it. So I want to thank both of them, and with that, I hope we still have some property owners on the line. If we do, we really would like to hear your input. There is a lot here, and the more you can ask questions and raise concerns, and that will help us better understand what needs to be addressed and how we go about synthesizing this so that we can really talk to our residents and property owners about it. So if nobody has anything else, we will be adjourned.
Thank you, Stephanie and Chris.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Guys.
Thank you, Stephen. Nicely done.
All right, take care.